Well, our Bible reading for today follows right after the passage we read last week. As we continue our sermon series on humor in the Bible, Jesus is actually getting on kind of a roll here. He's just told a story about a widow and an unjust judge, and now Jesus tells another story. And this one's about a Pharisee and a tax collector. In this one, I think the humor is a little more obvious, at least if we can put ourselves into the story. You know, one of the incredible things about Jesus and the stories he told is how he was able to put such instantly recognizable characters into those stories. You remember last week I told you that when Jesus described the judge, it instantly brought to mind a judge that I'd had dealings with. It's the same thing here. The people who were listening to Jesus would immediately recognize the characters in this story. In fact, they probably thought of specific people they knew when they heard this story that Jesus told. So Jesus sets up the story. He keeps it simple. In fact, this is such a simple, well-crafted story. I wonder if Jesus might have worked it all out ahead of time, was just waiting for a chance to use it. There's only two characters. We have a Pharisee, we have a tax collector. That's it. No extraneous people in there to muddle up the story. And we only have one location, the temple. So let's start with the Pharisee. Now, the Pharisees were the leaders of the most powerful religious group in Jerusalem at that time. And people respected them for that. That respect was real. There was nothing phony, nothing artificial about it. The Pharisees were considered to be very religious people. But at the same time, people knew that the Pharisees could be kind of arrogant. They could be pretty full of themselves sometimes. Not probably to the extent that Jesus suggests here, but still, they had that attitude about them. You know, they let people know that they thought they were a little bit better than everybody else. So Jesus has this Pharisee go to the temple to pray. And of course, as a very religious person, the Pharisee addresses his prayer to God. Prayer is addressed to God, and yet the Pharisee's prayer is really all about himself, isn't it? And he's praying good and loud to make sure that everybody there hears him too. He may technically be talking to God, but he's clearly playing to his human audience as well. And Jesus has this Pharisee going on and on about how great he is. How he's better than this person, he's better than that person, he's better than another person. And as he does that, I can just hear Jesus' audience laughing at that. And they'd be going, yep, that's a Pharisee for you, all right. That's how they are. They'd have been getting a good laugh at the thought of this Pharisee praying like this. And then there's the tax collector. Now, the tax collectors were almost universally disliked at that time. Not that they're so loved now, of course, but at that time they were really disliked. Because remember how the tax system worked back then. We've talked about before. The tax collector's job was to send a certain amount of money to Rome. And that was it. How the tax collector got that money, that was up to him. Rome did not care. He just had to get it and send it to him. That was all. And the thing was, the way that the tax collector got paid for his job was by collecting more money than he was required to send in. That was his salary. Anything he could collect over and above what he had to send to Rome was his to keep. So basically, we're talking about legally authorized theft here. The tax collector had an incentive to collect as much money as he could, because that's what his income was based on. Now, I'm sure there were probably some tax collectors who were fair and honest and just, and they only taxed people enough so they could get a fair wage for their services. There were enough of the other kind that it ruined the reputation of all of them. People may not have liked the Pharisees, but they did respect them as religious authorities. People neither liked nor respected the tax collectors. They may have feared them, but that was it. So again, when Jesus starts talking about this tax collector, an instant picture forms in people's minds. And when Jesus has the tax collector asking for mercy from God, I think people probably started laughing again. Not because they could imagine the Pharisee praying that way, but precisely because they could not. They could not imagine a Pharisee going, or a tax collector. They could not imagine a tax collector going into the temple and praying for mercy. Like any tax collector would ever care about God. Like God would ever give mercy to somebody like that anyway. So people are basically laughing at both of these characters. And they're ready for the punchline. And so Jesus gives it to them. Jesus says, and it's the tax collector, not the Pharisee, who's justified before God. And all of a sudden the laughter stops. Everybody goes, huh? They look at each other, puzzled. That was not the punchline anybody expected. They might possibly have expected the Pharisee to get knocked down a peg or two. They certainly did not expect a tax collector to be the hero of the story. A tax collector getting honor and forgiveness before God instead of a Pharisee? How in the world did that make any sense? And Jesus goes on to tell them the point. All those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. And once again, I am struck by how many times the Bible talks about the sin of arrogance. It's all through the Old Testament, and it's all through the New Testament too. And I think the reason why the Bible talks so much about arrogance is that is such an easy sin for all of us to fall into. It is so easy for us to think that we're better than we are. And it's so easy for us to think that we're better than other people. So easy for us to do that, and every time we do, we commit the sin of arrogance. Because here's the other thing about how great Jesus was at describing the characters in his stories. I said we can all recognize somebody we know when Jesus describes these characters, and that's true. But if we're honest, if we're really honest with ourselves, we can also recognize ourselves in these stories that Jesus tells. Because the truth is that each one of us has some of both of these characters inside of us. Each one of us has a little bit of that Pharisee in us. We would never come out and say it, of course, the way the Pharisee does in Jesus' story. We still have it in us. We look at certain people. A lot of times it's the people who are looked down upon by society. We say, well, I may not be perfect, but I'm sure a lot better than they are. I go to church at least sometimes, and I'm honest, more or less. And I don't cheat people, not to any great extent anyway. Not claiming to be perfect, but hey, there's a lot of people out there who are a lot worse, so overall I think I'm pretty much okay. It's arrogance. We make excuses for ourselves. We give ourselves a break for the things we do wrong. And we look down on others thinking that they're worse. We convince ourselves that we're better than we are. We convince ourselves that we're better than other people too. It's arrogance. But at the same time, each of us also has a little bit of the tax collector in us. Because deep down, we know that those excuses we make for our bad behavior, we know they don't really work. We know that we're not really as good as we try to convince ourselves that we are. We know that no matter how hard we might try to convince ourselves, we're not really that much better than others either. We're not really any better than anybody else. And we know that ultimately it really does not matter if we're better than anybody else or not, because God's not going to compare us to other people. God sees each one of us, and God sees in each one of us a sinner in need of mercy and forgiveness and salvation. We know that we are the tax collector, but we don't even belong in God's presence. And yet we know that we need to very humbly ask God to have mercy on us for all of our sins. If we're really honest with ourselves, we can see ourselves in both characters in this story. So the question is, which one will we ultimately be? Will we be the Pharisee, convincing ourselves that we're better than other people? Convincing ourselves that we're better than we know we are? Or will we be the tax collector, knowing that we are sinners in need of forgiveness and mercy and salvation? And we cannot just answer that question today. We'll need to answer it tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that, and every day of our lives. Every day, we decide whether we're the Pharisee or the tax collector. We may not be conscious of making that decision, but we make it just the same. The Pharisee was convinced that he was better than others. He even cited evidence to prove it. But the tax collector knew that he was a sinner who did not even deserve to be in the presence of God. And all he could do was ask God for mercy. And God gave it to him. And if you and I go to God and humbly ask for mercy, God will give it to us too. And then, like the tax collector, we will find ourselves justified and exalted before God. Amen.